Okay.
Wow.
So I sent
Well,
those to
I welcome
Leah.
you back. I'm glad we're meeting together to talk about these things. Now, this has to do with your church history class, and I'm just providing some supplementary material. And I was asked to talk about the growth of conciliarism, and then the emergence of what is called the Old Catholic Church, and then focus it down and to where the ecumenical Catholic communion is connected with that. So there's a whole sweep of history. So the idea, even though the ecumenical Catholic communion was not formally founded until 2003 as an ecclesial organization, I'm wearing these weird glasses. It is, could you stop that for a second? I'm sorry, because I got the wrong book. I got my computer glasses, so I can't see anybody. So, I think what we did the last time we were together is we were asking this question: how shall we govern ourselves as the universal or the Catholic Church? And we noted that in the first millennium of the church began, and there's a strong case made from the conciliarist point of view, that the church was originally governed by council and through council. And there were local councils, and then there were what they were called universal or general or ecumenical councils in the first millennium. And, but at the same time, in the first millennium, there were developments that were occurring on the Italian peninsula in Rome, which led to the emergence of a different understanding of how the church would maintain its unity and be governed. And it was the idea of the Bishop of Rome being like the universal monarch over the entire church. Eventually, that's the idea that emerges. But there was a tendency in that direction anyway. And it's complicated. There are many reasons for that. But primarily what happened was the Roman Empire had two emperors, one in the east and one in the west, because it was a vast amount of territory. And this is really something that started already before Constantine and the emergence of the Christian Empire. And so when the emperor of the Western Church, the last emperor, was deposed, I think even killed, there was no successor. And there was a real breakdown of society, and this is in the 5th century. And it was a time of great turmoil in Western Europe, because the barbarians from the north, the Germanic barbarians, were beginning to migrate into the western part of the Roman Empire. And so militarily they were taking over. And this was a crisis. It was really considered the fall of Rome. And what emerges in the vacuum, because you have no longer an emperor in the West, and the Roman emperor in the East, who was in Constantinople, and that's what we call the Byzantine Empire. Looking back, that's what we call it. Wasn't strong enough to be able to. There were efforts to try to reclaim the western half of the empire, particularly under Justinian, but ultimately that wasn't going to work. The forces of history were already, the die was cast, the barbarian hordes were coming in, the Germanic tribes. So the only leader that was recognized by most of the people and who began to emerge and take on a lot of civil responsibility without an emperor was the Pope. You know, he was the Bishop of Rome, and he was in a position, or the popes were in a position, to be able to provide leadership at a very critical time in the western part of Europe. So that is what's contributed to thinking of the Pope in terms of a monarch. So the popes of the Middle Ages were not only pastoral leaders in the church, they were also civil leaders, temporal leaders. They had the spiritual authority, and they also had temporal authority. They actually had territory that they governed. Popes would lead armies into battle. So because they were both an earthly prince and the head of the church. That's hard for us to conceive of because we think of Pope Francis right now. It's hard for us to think of him as leading an army. But this was the state of affairs in the early Middle Ages and throughout the medieval period. But there was an ideology, and you can understand this ideology. The ideology was that emerged during this time, and the Pope played an important role of that, is the idea of Christian civilization. They called it Christendom. So, for nearly 1,000 years in Western Europe, everybody was baptized, and you had one civilization. You had different kings and kingdoms. Nation states were not yet fully formed. They didn't have the emergence of nation states. That would happen towards the end of the medieval period and into the early modern period. So people all over Western Europe were united because they all shared a common church, common religion, a common culture. Even though there were regional vernacular languages, the language of all the educated and ruling elites in Europe was Latin. And the Mass was in Latin. And it sort of, if you went to Mass in England or Scotland or down in Sicily or in Spain, it would be the same everywhere. No difference. And you would know what was going on. Even if you didn't know Latin, you at least knew, you were familiar enough with the liturgy. So there was this Latin Christian civilization called Christendom. And unity was a high value. And of course, in the Middle Ages, what unified a people was a monarch. And so having a monarchical pope with both spiritual and temporal power was something that held that society together. And it's quite an achievement, because the reality is, in normative situations throughout history in all societies were deeply divided and fragmented. The fact that they could unify a multi-ethnic civilization together so that people all identified themselves as being a part of this civilization, which they called Christendom, and they were all members by virtue of the baptism. That's why baptism was so important, both civilly and religiously, because it held us all in common. We're all the same. Even though I might be speaking German and you might be speaking Italian, we were part of the same society, the same civilization. So it's really quite remarkable of what they were able to achieve. And so there were those who were in positions of power throughout Europe within the church, and the church was extremely powerful politically, as well as in civil government, that saw the value of ultramontanism. Because it was like, it holds everyone. It gave a center to the civilization, to Christian civilization, and it held it together. And that, in their mind, was the way of bringing the kingdom of God to earth. A Christian society. And so it was a rather utopian ideal. But they really did establish a common morality, common way in which they looked at how the society, how laws would be made and how laws would be followed. And they truly tried to create civil laws that were in accord with the precepts of Christianity. So they really were making an attempt to create a truly Christian civilization. It's really quite remarkable. And that's really the exception to all of history. You don't find anything quite like that again. it eventually falls apart.
What years were these?
This would be
is
from the 5th century to the 15th century.
Because it was during that time that the papal bulls were written that determined the enslavement and the takeover of the discovered lands such as the Americas, Africa, and things like that.
Yeah, when that happened, which was somewhat of a historical accident, because at the time when the Americas were discovered by Western Europeans, after Columbus and thereafter, Western European civilization wasn't the most advanced. But with the discovery of the Americas and exploiting what they had discovered, enormous wealth flowed in, and then that had an impact on the economy and creativity and inventions and all kinds of things. By the way, here's something interesting, kind of a parenthetical thing that I will add, and this is my thinking on this, but the reason why Columbus and all of the Western Europeans sailed westward to find a route to the Indies, to China, and all those places over there, was because of the Ottoman Empire and the Muslims in the East, because they couldn't have access to that trade without passing through the Muslim-dominated lands.
Overland.
Overland. Mm-hmm. And even then, even if they went by sea, it was like you go to the Mediterranean Sea, get out, have a caravan take you to the Red Sea, and then you go on. The Portuguese made the trip around the Horn of Africa, around the what's that called? Good Hope, the Cape of Good Hope or something, I can't remember. Well, and so they were looking for an economical way to get around the Muslims. Now think about that. If Islam wasn't around, so Islam historically created a condition by which Christianity that couldn't penetrate east went west, discovered all these lands, and also down into Africa. They were trying to find, they were economically driven. It wasn't the only thing. But they really, when Columbus came and was claiming all the Americas, which he didn't know was a new continent, and for Hispania, he was also claiming them for Christendom, the Catholic Church. And he was motivated by certainly the desire for wealth, which we use the word gold, but he truly was a man of his civilization and faith, and he also saw it as a way of bringing Christianity, the gospel, to the unconverted throughout the world. So that was a big motivation. It had disastrous consequences for the native peoples here that had been separated for tens of thousands of years, right? From Eurasia. So it would change everything. But that was the motivation. So the papacy played a big role in the holding together of that civilization. But then there was a crisis in that system. And we talked about that, where they had 2 popes, and then they tried to fix it by electing a third, and then they had 3 popes at the same time. They called that the Great Papal Schism. And that went on for nearly a century. Not quite that long, but more than one generation. And so the only way they could resolve it was by calling a council. They called one in Pisa, Italy, and they tried to, through that council, to resolve this schism, and they failed in doing so. In fact, it was out of that they got the 3rd pope. What they wanted is the other 2 to abdicate, and we got this new guy. And they got the new guy, but the other 2, so they had 3 popes. And so that moved them towards, in the beginning of the 15th century, the early 1400s, the Council of Constance, And in that council, this theological tension between the Ultramontanists, and they had a growing interest, and they were dominant for quite some time. But with this crisis, the papacy lost all credibility, as you can imagine. And because the papacy, as an institution, was ill-equipped to resolve the problem. They couldn't resolve the problem. So it required a council. And out of that, the Conciliarists, which was a stream of thought the whole time, was saying, this is the time to get rid of that idea of the monarchical pope, and that we would have the highest authority in the church would be the ecumenical council. Yes.
And didn't that kind of coincide with the rise of what would be nation states and more powerful local monarchs? And
that's
stuff
right.
Like
that this was all happening simultaneously. So I'm giving you a relatively simple narrative. It's much more complex because nationalism was beginning to be birthed, and particularly where there were strong monarchs, like in Spain and France, and then there was kind of this weaker monarchy in England that was up and coming. And they would become the three great national powers in Western Europe. But at this time, then the principle of conciliarism was established as being preeminent. That would not last long. Out of Constance, they wanted to have an ecumenical council meet once every 10 years. Can you imagine having a Vatican II every 10 years? And you would have to meet that frequently if you're going to rightly govern the church. They didn't want to abolish the papacy. They thought having the Pope and still utilizing him as a symbol of unity and giving him the responsibility of being the administrator of the church between councils. But what ends up happening is that no one called any more ecumenical councils. Not until the 16th century, when Luther came along, and there was this breakout of what would become known as the Protestant Reformation. It's really important for us to always remember the Protestants were Roman Catholics, and they saw themselves as Catholic, but they saw the institution of the papacy as corrupt. That's what they came to. Martin Luther, very early on, really felt that when the Pope was notified of what was going on, there was a great controversy taking place in Wittenberg, in Saxony, which was in the domains of the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany. So when Luther first came out, he really believed in the papacy. He knew the Pope would support him because he had Scripture on his side. And unfortunately, for Luther, the Pope just saw it. At that time, he was one of the Borgia popes, which were a very corrupt crime family that took over the papacy at this time. Then they excommunicated Luther. And he was stunned, he was shocked. And he becomes very bitter about that. And you see that in his writings. By the way, Luther, if you get a chance to read any of his writings, in translation of course, he's readable, he's easy to read. And he's very passionate, and he's very emotional, he's very smart, and so you can read his stuff, but some of it's excessive at times. But that was the nature of the times. So the Pope didn't side with him, and now Luther was demanding that there would be an ecumenical council to resolve the issue. And of course, in the meantime, Luther's becoming more radical, and then the ecumenical council comes way too late, and that was the Council of Trent. By that time, and here's the thing, when an ecumenical council finally came together, the leaders of the rebelling churches, the Protestant churches, were invited to participate. But there was so much bad blood, because this was a few decades later, they refused. So the split of Western Christianity into Protestant and Roman Catholic, there's faults on both sides. The church truly split. And we're living with that split to this very day. And they couldn't resolve. There were those who were hoping that it would be resolved. People were forced to make terrible choices. Which way you were going to go. Many people suffered. They persecuted each other. They killed each other. So there were martyrs on both sides. And it was a very chaotic time, a difficult time. So I guess you've gotten that part in your church history. So what happens is that the Council of Trent, with the absence of the Protestant leaders, then became intent upon bringing stability and unity back to the church. And it did reform the Roman Catholic Church and got rid of a lot of the abuses the Protestants were criticizing them for. So they did do that. Give you one example of that, concubinage. Priests were not married, but they had women in their lives and children. And that was called concubinage. You know, it meant that the children had no claim on the property. There was no legal standing within the church. So this was widespread. There was a lot of corruption in the monasteries. The Council of Trent cleaned that all up. So the Council of Trent did try honestly to reform the church. But their second objective was to establish greater authority from Rome. So a lot of things that were the prerogative of local bishops were taken away from local bishops and given to Rome. So the papacy as an institution became even more powerful in the Roman Catholic Church. Couldn't touch the Protestant churches. So you see, that's what has happened at this point in time. Then there was not a new council. That Trent was in the 1500s. It wasn't until the 19th century, the 1800s, that there is another council called. But this council was totally in the control of Pius IX. And Pius IX was the longest reigning pope ever, longer than John Paul II. He was very liberal. He was very open to modern ideas. So when they elected him, they thought they were electing a progressive pope. But 19th century Europe was beset by all kinds of social revolutions. This is when you have people like Marx, Karl Marx and Engels writing, you know, there was a lot of radicalism, political radicalism happening in the 19th century. And the old ways were being criticized. Well, in the Revolution of 1848, and there was a revolution that began in Paris, spread throughout Europe, in which they really wanted to change all European society. It was a real threat to all of the royal families and the heads of the church and all of this. And so it was the conservatives and the royal families that managed to crush that revolution. And so what happened is that the European kingdoms that were there were very conservative, very authoritarian. And with the rise of nationalism, the Pope was now having to deal with very powerful monarchs that were going to do what they wanted to do. And the Pope couldn't control the monarchs. He didn't have power that he once held in Christendom. Another thing that happened is, late in the 19th century, Italian nationalism came along. Italy was broken up into all these principalities. And about 1/3 of the Italian peninsula was actually called the Papal States. The Pope was the civil ruler of the Papal States. Well, with Garibaldi and the Italian Revolution and the nationalism, they unified and they took the Papal States away from the Pope, Pope Pius IX. So Pius IX was on the defensive. He was losing his power to monarchs who refused to cooperate with his program. And in Italy, he loses his temporal estates. And he walls himself up in the Vatican City and never comes out. You know. And so he refused to recognize the new Italian the kingdom that was established. And so he begins to implement a program in the view of the loss of the prestige and authority of the papacy by formally defining the, let me write these two things. Oh, I don't have a pen. There are two things that he wanted to achieve. One is he wanted to make the idea, it was a theory, it was an idea of papal infallibility. He wanted to make it a dogma. Now, up until this time, there were some Catholics that believed in the infallibility of the Pope. That idea had been around. But there were many Catholics that didn't believe that. So you had two opinions. So Pius wanted to resolve this question. And what infallibility means, it refers to the teaching authority of the Pope. When it comes to anything to do with morality or theology, the teaching of the Church, the Pope is the final word. He himself will determine that. And he can speak from the chair of Peter, ex cathedra, and his word then in that case is infallible, the matter is set. Now before this time, from the earliest times in the church, which I showed you the last time, questions of ethics and theology were always resolved in the context of council. Pius IX made sure that you didn't need a council. It could be him. And he's famous for saying this line. Get this. Pius IX. He was a character. I am the church. I am the church. When I speak, the church speaks. I am the church. I mean, he would say that. I can't imagine Pope Francis saying that today. But anyway, that was his attitude. So now, the problem was there any precedence historically where a dogma was proclaimed by the Roman Catholic Church through the office of the Pope only, apart from council? There never was. Until 1854. And this is how clever Pius IX was. In the 19th century, in European Roman Catholicism, Marian devotion was at its zenith. And Marian devotion and Roman Catholics had a great love for Mary and their devotions to Mary. And it was one of the ways that they could solidify their own identity to be different than the Protestants, because the Protestants had completely rejected that. So in a way, it was a way of really defining Catholic identity. So Marian devotion was at its peak in the 19th century. And this was reinforced by, at this time, there were Marian apparitions happening. So that reinforced it. So in the popular spirituality and devotional life of the average Roman Catholic, they went to Mass every Sunday, but they didn't understand it. It was in Latin. But they prayed the Rosary, and so they felt very close to the Blessed Mother, to Mary. And so in popular devotion, devotion to Mary was the biggest thing. And it was the thing that probably united Roman Catholics at that period of time the most. So there was another idea or doctrine called the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception was an idea that came out of the Middle Ages, but it was never universally held on to. Are you having a good time so far?
Yeah.
Okay, good. The Immaculate Conception has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus or the conception of Jesus. That's a misunderstanding. The Immaculate Conception is the idea that Mary had to have been without sin, and in the Western Church, without original sin. That means, since according to Augustine, which was the way both Catholics and Protestants thought in these terms, original sin is passed on original sin is passed on through the sexual act, so that every person that is born into the world already has original sin. They're already a sinner from the moment they're conceived, because that's where original sin, when that sperm hits that egg, original sin is passed on, as well as the color of your hair and eyes and all that. And so the idea was that Mary could not have had original sin and conceived Christ. She would have had to have been pure and spotless. The question was, when did she become the pure and spotless vessel? Now, this was a debate throughout Christendom for 1,000 years. In the Eastern Church, it was believed that she was cleansed, or she was a pure vessel at the time of the Annunciation. Other than that, before that, she was an ordinary person, and that's when she was made pure. Because the Eastern Church also agreed, even though they didn't have the idea of original sin, they did agree that she had to be pure. She had to be sinless in order to bear God in her womb in the Incarnation. So there was debates about when this occurred. And one of the proposals put forth in the Middle Ages is that she was immaculately conceived. When her parents, Joachim and Anna, had sexual relations and she was conceived, God, the Holy Spirit, prevented in the conception of original sin being passed on. That's what it means. So that she was sinless throughout her entire life, from the moment of her conception in the womb of Jesus. Now, some theologians who are renowned, and you'll love these theologians, agreed with that. They liked that. Some theologians that you like and love disagreed with that. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas rejected that idea. He didn't accept that. But then St. Bonaventure thought it was a great idea. And you could just divide all the saints and thinkers of the Middle Ages into one of these two. I mean, they just took sides. So this was an unresolved question. Even when the Protestants came along, it was unresolved. Even the Protestants didn't have it resolved. And in time, the Protestants didn't much care about the issue, because they gave up on Marian devotion, even though Luther always practiced Marian devotion all his life. He never rejected that. Okay. So, this is the big question. Who's right on this question? So, in the 19th century, Pius IX, who was sincere, wanted to resolve this question. He was clearly on the Immaculate Conception side of the issue. But also, he was clever. He thought, I will resolve this question once and for all on my own authority. He did not call a council in 1854. In other words, he put forth a papal bull that at that moment said that the Immaculate Conception is the true teaching of the Catholic Church. It has now been elevated to the level of dogma. Everyone has to believe it on pain of sin. So now it becomes a dogma. When we say a dogma, it means we're elevating a teaching to the level of the creed. So he does that. people rejoiced. Not the Protestants, they didn't care. But most of the Roman Catholics thought, great idea, we don't have to be fighting about this anymore, it's over, you know, and because Marian devotion was really popular among the rank and file, this is great. So it was greeted with great joy. And then you have this Marian apparition in Lourdes, in which Our Lady who appears in Lourdes says, when she was being inquired of her identity, she says, I am the Immaculate Conception. Of course, Bernadette could not possibly know what that meant. You know, she was a little girl. That's a complicated theological thought. And also it's kind of peculiar. The Immaculate Conception is something that happens, and she's saying, I am the Immaculate Conception. So anyway, this just really was the thinking of the time. It fit within the devotion to the people, and it was extremely popular. So Pius IX cleverly put this through because he knew everybody would go along with it. There were a few holdouts. So that was in 1854. In 1869, he calls for a council. And it's going to be in Rome. And it's in the Vatican. And that's why it's called Vatican Council #1. At that time, it was just called the Vatican Council. And he had one purpose only, to have the council define two things. One, the infallibility of the papal office, that when whoever the Pope may be speaks ex cathedra from the chair of Peter regarding theology or faith and morals, it's infallible. He has the authority to do that. Here's another thing that goes with it, another component that's sometimes overlooked because we focus on the infallibility. Universal primacy. That's a legal term because bishops have jurisdictions. They're like the governors of their diocese. They have a jurisdiction. Universal primacy meant that the Pope has jurisdiction over every single baptized Christian. It didn't matter if you were Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. Ultimately, you're under the Pope's authority, juridically speaking. He has universal primacy. And every Christian must acknowledge that. So you had the theological infallibility, it has to do with teaching, and then about governance. The Pope has absolute power to appoint bishops where he wants to remove bishops where he wants to pronounce an interdict over a group of people, excommunicate as many people he wants, doesn't matter where in the world. You know, that's the kind of power he had. It was a very contentious council.
I have a question. Yes. That was in 1869, but 15 years prior to that, he elevated Immaculate Conception to the level of dogma.
On his own authority.
How could he do that without first having infallibility as the Pope?
Well, this is what he did. He had to show that there was a
precedent?
case, a precedent.
Okay.
And he picked the most popular. It was like low-hanging fruit. 98% of Catholics would have said, yeah, we love the Mother of our Lord. Yes, of course.
And that had stood for 15 years by the time this...
Yeah, and so they'll say, well, so the objection was the Pope never had such power. Oh, in 1854 I did, and you went along with it then.
Oh.
He declared something to be a dogma. It was unprecedented in 1854, but by the time you get to 1869, he could point to it.
Yeah.
When this happened, Lord Acton said this: power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He was referring to Pius IX. Now, Vatican Council didn't want to go along with this. It was hard. He had to persuade the bishops. The majority went along with him, but it wasn't enough. So he put pressure on the bishops. And some of the bishops that were opposed to it decided, I'm leaving. They didn't leave the church, they just left the council. One of the bishops that opposed it was the American bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas. Can't remember his name. And there were a few other bishops, so they left, which was the worst possible thing they could do. Because the council is still going on, and their votes are gone. The remaining opposition to this, he locked them in the rooms and gave them only bread and water and made them miserable. And this is in the middle of summer in Italy. And you're locked up in this room. You guys ready to vote now? Yeah, I want to go home. Who cares? So he twisted around, he did everything and put the pressure on until he got what he wanted. And so in 1870, the teaching of papal infallibility and universal primacy of the papal office now became a dogma that must be believed. In other words, it's a point of faith that is at the level of the creed. Of course, the Protestants, the Church of England, and the Orthodox said, no, it was bad for ecumenical relations, I'll put it in that, yeah, boy. But that's how it happened. And so there was no longer a need for an ecumenical council. From now on, the vision was, there's a question about a point of doctrine or morality. The Pope has sufficient power to resolve that question by decree. Then, in 1958, you have Roncalli, an Italian bishop. I think he was he the Bishop of Milan at that time? Oh, I can't remember. You can check that out. Anyway, he's elected to be Pope. The problem was, it was in that conclave, it was the man they really wanted, the man who was almost a hand-picked successor for Pius XII, who was Pope at that time. He really wanted this man who would become Pope Paul VI. But Pope Paul VI at that time, he wasn't Paul VI, he was Montini was his name. He was too young. He was not of a canonical age. So the idea was, let's elect this old Pope, and he was old, Roncalli, and he'll be a caretaker Pope until the guy we really want is at the right age. And then in fact, that's what happened. He was only Pope for 5 years. He died of cancer in 1963. Well, not long after he's elected Pope, he's in one of the chapels in the Vatican City with the Vatican Curia, and he's celebrating Mass. And then while he's at the altar, he turns around and says, I'm going to call an ecumenical council. The Vatican Curia is the bureaucracy. They're entrenched. They're the deep state of the Catholic Church. And they're thinking, what? We don't need them anymore. That's a thing of the past. So what could they do? He called for it, and they thought, we'll prepare for it. So they did. And they prepared all kinds of documents for it. And they just thought, we'll invite the bishops of the world, they'll just rubber stamp what we have written. And some of it had to do with issues of discipline. There was a strong push for more Marian definition, because Pius XII in 1952 defined ex cathedra that the Assumption was now a dogma rather than a pious belief. So elevated that. So they thought, this is the direction we're going to go in. And so what they didn't realize is that John the 23rd, Roncalli became John the 23rd, I shall be called John, had other ideas. He was a closet conciliarist. And so he calls for Vatican II. The church needed reforming. They needed a council. And it was so popular, the whole world had their eyes on the Roman Catholic Church. And they did a lot of good things. Even the Vatican Curia thought some of the things would be good, like taking away the stigma that the church put on Jews. You know, they came out and said the Jews are not responsible collectively for the crucifixion of Jesus, which was official church teaching before that, not dogma, but teaching. So a lot of good things came out of it. But when all the bishops of the world gathered and they were presented the documents that were prepared by the Vatican Curia, the bishops voted to throw those documents out. And the Vatican Curia goes, "What? We're going to go tell the Pope, John the 23rd, this is what they're doing. We can't let them do this." And he supported the bishops of the church. And that's where you get the Vatican II documents. And a time of great renewal. And some really great stuff came out of Vatican II. But anyway, that's what happened in Vatican II. They couldn't invite voting delegates from the Protestants and the Orthodox, but they did invite observers to be there, and they did invite the old Catholics. And you're thinking, "Oh, Catholics, who are those guys?" That's what we're going to get to tonight. How are you doing? You doing okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Says he was the Patriarch of Venice.
That's what it was, Venice. Thank you. Ron Colley was the Patriarch of Venice. Okay, so how is it that the old Catholics came into existence? And it began, I want to give you a handout. Just 2 pages each. Here you go. Take that home. Here's for you.
Barbara, could I please have a copy of the handout you emailed to me?
Oh, are you there, Barb?
Yes, I've been listening the whole time.
Oh, is it coherent?
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
Okay.
You can
Okay.
Dominique.
We're going to send yours electronically.
Thank you.
Okay. The title of the handout is Bishop Dominique Marie Varlet. This guy is really important in our history because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be sitting here today. And Barb, you wouldn't be listening to us from Florida. Now, to give you a little bit of background, the intellectual center of Catholicism throughout the late Middle Ages and even into the modern period was the University of Paris. And so there was a convent there called Port Royal. And Port Royal began, there was a spiritual renewal going on in this convent, and it spilled over throughout France and Belgium and the Netherlands. And it was a very rigorous spirituality, and the person that was the main spokesperson for this spirituality was a man by the name of Jansen, yeah. And it's Jansenism that I'm referring to. It was very popular in the 1600s in Paris, throughout France, and in Northern Europe among Catholic populations. Someone who was very much a part of this this is the early 1700s, that was a big part of this spiritual movement that was occurring within Catholicism in this part of the world was, you know him because his name is Pascal, and you know him as a mathematician. He was a brilliant mathematician, He also was a Roman Catholic spiritual, and he really was influenced and was a part of this Jansenist school. Jansenism is an extreme form of Augustinian theology, and it was they were the extremists of Augustinian theology in the Roman Catholic Church, as Calvin was an expression of the extreme Augustinian among Protestants. See, Protestants and Catholics are both Augustinian, but among the Protestants, the Reformed tradition, which comes from Calvin, is the extreme Augustinians. In Roman Catholicism, it was the Jansenists. They were rigorists. They were very moralistic. And this is when they were obsessed with people's sexual behavior. You would say nowadays they were puritanical, but that's kind of an insult to the Puritans. I mean, they were extreme. And this was also a very popular spirituality in Ireland as well. And this is why the Catholicism from Northern Europe, particularly the Irish and the French, is much more suspicious of human sexuality. And a lot of Catholics, like in our parents' generation who grew up, even though Jansenism was condemned by the Pope, it still had a strong influence, particularly in the area of sexual ethics. And that's why there was for so long such an obsession and guilt over sexual sins. I'm not a Jansenist, but it was a popular renewal, spirituality that was happening, and it was noted for its moral rigorism. But they tended to be very legalistic, and they really believed in determinism, like the Calvinists. Double predestination, those kinds of things. The Jesuits opposed the Jansenists, and there's a battle between the Jesuits and the Jansenists. And the Jesuits get the ear of Louis XIV. You know Louis XIV, King of France. And they turn the King of France against the Jansenists, and he condemns them and forces the people who were the teachers of Jansen. By this time Jansen himself is dead, because he came in the previous century, but he drove them out of France. Where do they go? They go to the Netherlands for refuge, because Netherlands tolerates religious dissidents. Now here's the thing, the Netherlands is a Protestant country. They have a Roman Catholic minority, but the king and queen of the Netherlands are Protestants, and the kind of Christianity that the Netherlands, the kind of Protestant Christianity that was the official church of the Netherlands, was the Protestant Reformed Church. We call it the Dutch Reformed. Now, in our country nowadays, you'll see some churches with the name Reformed. You'll see them especially in Michigan, wherever there was a lot of Dutch settlements, there's the Dutch Reformed Church. The Crystal Cathedral was built by Robert Schuller, Sr., Dutch Reformed. Schuller was a Dutch name. The other Calvinists, or the other major branch of Reformed Christianity in the United States, are the Presbyterians. And the Presbyterian Church was formed in Scotland. It's essentially the Church of Scotland. You know?
Yeah.
And so, but they shared the same theology as the Dutch Reformed Church. So anyway, the majority of Christians in Holland, or the Netherlands, are Dutch Reformed. And so it's also the official state religion. The Roman Catholic Church in the Netherlands was a minority church, but they were tolerated at this time. So the Jansenist Roman Catholics fled to the Netherlands, and they were granted protection by the Archbishop of Utrecht. So then, the Pope comes out and condemns Jansenism. And in this article, there's a mention of the bull that was issued. So the Pope sided with the Jesuits. And you know, if I was the Pope at that time, I probably would have sided with the Jesuits, because I have no sympathy for that rigorous kind of Augustinianism that the Jansenists were advocating. However, remember I told you earlier that in the Protestant world, the extreme Augustinians were the Reformed Church. So the Dutch, who were Reformed, which meant they were extreme Augustinians, sympathized with the Jansenists. They had something in common. And the Archbishop of Utrecht protected them. And the Jesuits...
Now, so assuming the Archbishop wasn't a Calvinist because he was
Yeah.
Catholic, assuming he wasn't an extreme Augustinian,
Right.
why would he give harbor to the Jansenists?
I think he had Jansenist sympathies.
Okay.
It's unclear that he himself was a Jansenist. There's nothing that would indicate that. He just protected them, and he protected them from the encroachments of the Jesuits and from Rome. So then this is what happens. For hundreds of years, the Catholics, or the Catholic leadership of the Church of Utrecht, whenever there was the vacancy, they would elect their own bishop. This has been going on through most of the Middle Ages. This was a historical right that was granted to the Church of Utrecht. I know this gets complicated. I hope you're following me. Are you okay so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So, we're used to nowadays that if there's an episcopal vacancy in a Roman Catholic diocese, Rome appoints. Not in the case of Utrecht. They had a historic relationship and they could elect their own. And the Pope would affirm it and approve it, and then the consecration would happen. When there was a vacancy and the chapter there in Utrecht elected a new candidate, the Pope refused to affirm it and therefore would not have other bishops ordain their candidate. So now, the Roman Catholic Church in Holland, in the Netherlands, didn't have a bishop. They just didn't have a bishop. They were a bishopless church because of this situation with Rome. Now, Rome had their own idea of who they wanted to be bishop. So they sent their guy up there. They wanted to start exercising their power to appoint. And the Dutch Roman Catholics appealed to the King of Holland. And the King of Holland, who was Protestant, he didn't have any problem with this. He closed the borders. So the unwanted candidate, who was a bishop sent by Rome, was refused. And the Pope refused to recognize the man they had elected. So therefore they became a church without a bishop. You can exist for only so long as a Catholic church without a bishop. Yes.
Now this is when? When was this?
This is in the 1600s.
Oh, 1600.
Late 1600s. We're coming into the 1700s. Now, this is the case. This is the situation, and I want you to look at this article, which we will be sending to Barbara. But I think I've given you enough background on this, and I just want to read through this. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Bishop Dominique Marie Vallée was a Roman Catholic missionary priest who later served as Vicar General of the Diocese of Quebec, Canada. Remember, at this time it was a French possession. Later, as the Roman Catholic Bishop of Babylon, he caused a schism within the Roman Catholic Church by consecrating 4 successive men as Archbishop of Utrecht in the Netherlands. Let's read about this interesting character. Vallée was born in Paris, France, on March 15, 1678, to Achille Vallée and Marie Vallée. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Varley's family owned a home near Mount Valerian, I think, Valerian, a famous pilgrimage site where Varley came into contact with the congregation, this is French, des Prêtres du, I don't know French, do you?
Calvaire, yeah.
Okay, here it is in English. The Congregation of the Priests of Calvary, okay? Which he joined in 1699, okay? So he was about 21 years old. In 1701, Varley earned his baccalaureate from the Collège de Navarre, which was part of the University of Paris. He later earned his licentiate, then his doctorate in theology from the Sorbonne in 1706. So he was highly educated. This guy was a sharp cookie. That's not in the text. I just made that comment, Barb. Barb? Barb?
Sorry, I had you on mute, sorry.
Oh, okay. In 1706, Varley was ordained a priest and was assigned to serve various parishes in the Paris suburbs, including, and I won't even try to pronounce that location, where he was serving in 1708. I don't get French pronunciation. I don't understand the rules of French. Okay, but here's something interesting for us. He was a missionary priest to America. Back when France had Canada and what they called the Louisiana Territory, which wasn't just the state of Louisiana, it was like 1/3 of the what is now the United States. Okay. So, in 1711 he became part of a missionary society at the Seminary of Missions, the Foreign Missions of Paris, and he resigned as a parish priest in 1712. He was chosen to travel to the French territory of Louisiana and revive the mission for the Tamaroa tribe in Cahokia. Is that Cahokia? That's now East St. Louis in Illinois.
It's a very holy place.
Wow. Which had been without a priest since Father Mark Bergier's death in 1707. So now this has been about 5 years later. They're without a priest, and he's the missionary priest there. And the church that he built is still there to this day.
Mm.
It's the oldest Catholic church in Missouri.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to go there.
Yeah, you can visit it. It's really neat. It still looks like a wood structure.
Mm.
I really loved touring that church, and they were very friendly. It's kind of amusing. It's still a functioning church, but it's because of its historic significance, they expect tourists to come there. In January 1713, Varley sailed from Port Louis in the department of Morbihan and arrived on June 6th at Mobile Bay, Alabama, where he suffered from dysentery and spent time recovering with fellow religious Albert Davion and Francois Le Maury. His experience in the New World was not entirely positive, and he wrote that, far from being one of the marvels of the world, French Louisiana was wild and uncultivated country where the missionaries were few and the tribes were rough.
It doesn't change much.
Yeah. In 1715, Varley joined an expedition organized by Louisiana Governor Antoine de la Motte Cadillac and family, reached the mission of, you see what it's Holy Family is in English, of the Cahokia. The year he was, turn over the page, appointed Vicar General for the Mississippi and Illinois region of the Diocese of Quebec. He traveled to Quebec for the first time in 1717, leaving Cahokia on March 24th and arriving in Quebec on September 11th. He had hoped to recruit other priests to join him in Cahokia. On May 10th, 1718, Gaulvain, Calvarin, Dominique Anthony René Thamour de la Source, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, and Jean-Paul Mercier departed from Cahokia, Cahokia, but Varley would never return there. I think he got burnt out. Okay. After 13 months in Quebec, Varlet received orders dated September 17, 1718, that he had been appointed titular bishop of Ascalon and coadjutor bishop to Louis-Marie Pidot de Saint-Olan, bishop of the diocese of Babylon and Persia. These are old dioceses that may have no more Christians left, but they still exist on paper. So they basically made him a bishop of a diocese that is in Persia, the heart of Islamic territory. And now you're going to go there and rebuild the Catholic Church in Persia.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a great honor to become a bishop, but his assignment he wasn't happy about. On November 13th, he departed from La Rochelle, the Canadian port of the Kingdom of France, and arrived in Paris 2 weeks later. On February 19th, 1719, Varlet was consecrated titular bishop of Ascalon in the chapel of the Seminary of Foreign Missions in Paris by Jacques de Goyon, Mitinon, Bishop Emeritus of Condom, I guess that's a place, assisted by Louis Francois. Okay, anyway, you get it. And so, on the same day, he received news of Bishop Saint-Holland's death, was duly appointed his successor, and was urged to leave as soon as possible for his see in Persia. Okay. The next section, difficulties with the Roman Catholic Church. Consciously or not, Varlet left Paris on March 18, 1718, without signing his consent to the papal bull Unigenitus de Folias. This is the bull that condemns Jansenism. So he does it. We don't know. He probably had Jansenist sympathies, and he just acted like, I forgot to sign it. Okay? Which had previously condemned 101 Jansenist propositions by Pasquet Quesnel. One night, Varlet stopped through Brussels, where he failed to call on the internuncio, as was the custom. Upon arriving,
What is the internuncio?
That would be, the nuncio would be the Pope's personal representative in that part of the
like
world.
An ambassador or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, like an ambassador. That was the custom for him to check in. He goes to Amsterdam because he was going to pick up a ship to go to Persia. He goes, arriving in Amsterdam on April 2nd, Varlet agreed to confirm 604 orphans and other poor people there, since they could not afford to travel to other countries to receive the sacrament, and no bishop had celebrated the sacrament there since Archbishop Petrus Scotta's death 18 years prior.
Wow.
You see? There was a vacancy, so they approached him and said, hey, a bishop's in town. We have all these children to be confirmed. Varlet then left for his see in Babylon, arriving in Persia on October 9, 1718. So he does make it to Persia, but he passed through and he did all these confirmations for these Dutch Catholics. Varlet later moved to Shamake, now Azerbaijan. You've heard of that? Yeah. On 26 March 1720, he learned that Rome had suspended him. That was harsh. From his episcopal duties on May 7, 1719, following confirmation that he had failed to call upon the papal nuncio in Paris and give his adherence to the papal bull Unigenitus, that he had failed to call upon the internuncio at Brussels, and that he failed to obtain permission to perform episcopal functions in the Netherlands. You know, those confirmations. So he was being disciplined, and they really went extreme. They just suspended him. You know, it was overkill. Varlet insisted that coming from Canada, he knew nothing of Unigenitus, that he was ordered to travel as privately as possible or as secretly as possible, and that the chapter of Utrecht, which had jurisdiction during the vacancy of the see, had invited him to celebrate the sacrament of confirmation there. He also noted that his suspension was highly irregular. Now, irregular is a technical word in Roman Catholic canon law. It means it's illegal. Okay, irregular means it's against canon law. So he's saying that the Pope and the authorities did not even follow the canon law. And so that this suspension was invalid. That's his contention. You know, here's the funny thing. I'll give you an example how canon law sometimes can lead to certain absurdities. Not always. Canon law has its place. Here at St. Matthew's, any knowledgeable Roman Catholic theologian or canon lawyer would tell you that's a valid Mass. When they say it's a valid Mass, they mean to say that when we celebrate Eucharist here, Jesus really shows up in the Eucharistic celebration. And it is indeed his body and blood. That's a really important thing for Catholics. The validity, because validity is a way of saying authenticity. It's like it's really happening. However, it's irregular. So the sacraments we celebrate here are valid according to the theology and the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church and the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's irregular. In other words, every Sunday morning, Jesus shows up here illegally. Jesus is illegally present in our church. That just kind of, I like saying that. That's okay. Oh, okay, where was I? Oh, irregular. Since it seemed he was arbitrarily suspended without a trial or opportunity for defense, which is true. He's right about that. Canon law does protect people, and so that people can't just arbitrarily do something. They have to follow right procedure. Obliged to retrace his steps to Paris to lift the interdict, which is an excommunication, Varlet returned to Europe from Babylon, stopping through Amsterdam, where he sympathized with the plight of the Dutch Catholics because of their support of Jansenism. After Pope Clement XI, the author of Unigenitus, died in 1721, Varlet returned to Paris, where he stayed with Bishop Charles the Caylus of the Diocese of, how do you say that? Auxerre. Varlet obtained an opinion in his case from noted French canonist Jean-Pierre Gilbert, who suggested that Varlet's suspension was null and void. Several theologians at Paris, remember Paris was the intellectual center of Roman Catholicism, and Louvain supported this conclusion. In Rome, Francois de Martini, procurator of the Society of Missions, attempted to regularize Varlet's situation. Varlet returned to the Netherlands, where he began to elaborate a defense of his action and of the nullity of his suspension. Now, this is the moment. Varlet's consecration of other bishops. In 1723, Varlet became an appellant, that is, he's making appeal against the papal bull of Unigenitus, and allied himself with the Dutch Catholic clergy, who also refused to affirm the bull. Beginning in
I have a question.
Yeah.
So he's working on his defense, and now he goes and throws gas on the fire,
Yeah,
right?
he does.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Just let me make sure I was reading this right here.
yeah. But see, what's really moving him is, what I see in this, he's a pastor. Pastor's heart. He's there and he sees the plight of the faithful in Holland. And so, even though he's preparing his defense, somehow he decides to help them. And so, beginning in 1720, Varlet consecrated against the orders of the Pope a succession of priests as Archbishop of Utrecht. In the first instance of this, Pope Innocent XIII and his successor Benedict XIII had refused to confirm the election of Canon Cornelius van Steenhoven, who was elected Archbishop by the Cathedral chapter at Utrecht, but was suspected of Jansenism. The chapter of Utrecht had obtained an opinion from Zeger Bernhard van Espen and two other doctors at Louvain, noting that they had the right, in special circumstances, to elect their archbishop and have him consecrated without the consent of the Pope. and that, in the case of necessity, one bishop alone might consecrate another, and this is true. 19 doctors of the theological faculties at Paris, Nantes, Reims, and Padua approved of this opinion. Varlet consented to consecrate Van Steenhoven as the 7th Archbishop of Utrecht and did so on October 15, 1724 in the private chapel of the place where Varlet was staying in Amsterdam. Archbishop Steenhoven died in 1725. Within 6 months of his consecration, and the chapter of Utrecht asked Varlet to consecrate the successor they had selected. On September 30th, 1725, in the Church of St. James and St. Augustine in The Hague, Varlet consecrated Cornelius Johannes Bachman, whatever that name is, Voutier, as the 8th Archbishop of Utrecht. Archbishop Bachman, that would be Voutier, died in 1733, and the chapter of Utrecht again appealed to Varlet to consecrate the successor they had elected. On October 28, 1734, Varlet consecrated Theodorus van der Kroon as 9th Archbishop of Utrecht. Archbishop van der Kroon died in 1739. I don't know if I would want to be elected in this office.
way.
And the chapter of Utrecht appealed to Varlet one last time to consecrate the successor they had elected. And on October 18, 1739, Varlet consecrated Petrus Johannes Meindardsas, 10th Archbishop of Utrecht. Varlet was subsequently excommunicated as a schismatic. That's not surprising, along with the elected archbishops consecrated by him, as well as all their followers. The schism marked the birth of what later would be called the Old Catholic Church, which collected many opponents to the papal bull Unigenitus. Now we'll skip down what happens at the end of his life. By the time he consecrated Van der Kroon in 1739, Varlet was suffering from poor health and had already suffered his first stroke. In 1740, he suffered several strokes, and after a particularly serious stroke on Christmas Day, his health and mind seemed to be seriously impaired, and he entered into a long decline. Varlet died on May 14, 1742, having consecrated and shared valid lines of apostolic succession with 4 archbishops of Utrecht, the last of whom would become the source of apostolic succession for all later Old Catholic bishops. Oh,
Johannes.
is that good?
Yes.
Are you there, Barb?
Petrus Johannes.
Barb?
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm here.
we're getting through this. We're going to end this soon. So, what I have here is a visual aid. I want you to kind of see this. You're going to have to come around here, everybody.
Let's come over here.
I'll come over here. Okay, let's set this up over here. Okay. Come over here. I want you to see this, everybody. Okay, I got visual aid here. Here's our apostolic succession from Varlet. There he is. There's a portrait of Varlet. And then here's the last one he ordained. And here's the line of succession for the Dutch Catholic bishops. Until we come up to go this way, up here. Here is, I could find a photograph of Caspar Johannes Rinkel, who was consecrated 1873. Here's Gerardus Gull. Here, and he ordains Arnold Harris Matthew, a British nobleman, an English nobleman. And he starts the English Old Catholic Church. That's a whole nother story we'll get into next time. He consecrates an Austrian bishop, because the Austrian royal family was very devout. So he becomes a bishop in the Old Catholic Church of England, even though he's Austrian. And then World War I breaks out. And England's at war with Austria. So he has to leave. He can't go back to Austria. He goes to the USA. That's through him. That's how Old Catholicism came to the United States. he ordains an Italian Roman Catholic priest who was in dispute with the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States. You want to know why? The Roman Catholic hierarchy at this time in the United States were Irish. And the Irish looked down on the Italians. I'm sorry. And so he did not like the way the Italians were being excluded and treated by the Catholic hierarchy that was Irish. So he got himself consecrated by the prince so that he could minister freely to the Italian immigrant community over here. Then in the early 20th century, Mexico has a revolution. And during the Revolutionary War that occurred in Mexico at this time, the Roman Catholic Church supported the government, not the rebels. The rebels won. What did the rebels do? They start to persecute the Roman Catholic Church institution by confiscating their property and sending any foreign-born priests out of the country. And the Mexican revolutionary government in 1926 under President Calles says, we don't need the Roman Catholic Church here, we need a Mexican Catholic Church. Kind of a Henry VIII kind of thing. And so they contact Cardinal Henry Cafora, and he ordains them several bishops, and then there's formed a government-sponsored Mexican National Catholic Church.
Does that still exist?
There's more of a story.
Okay.
It exists, but it's kind of interesting. And there is one bishop who is in Los Angeles, East LA. And that's Alberto Rodriguez y Duran, and he was ordained for the Mexican community in Los Angeles, and they had a huge wooden church in East LA. It burns to the ground. It's torched by arsonists. He dies, but not before ordaining his younger brother, Emilio Rodriguez Fairfield. And that's the old Catholic bishop that I met who ordained me.
Wow.
Okay? And so I was ordained through the Mexican National Catholic Church in East LA. He's the bishop. I said, I'd like to go to Orange County and start an old Catholic mission. But there's no old Catholics in Orange County. Why would you want to do that?
Now that says Mexican National Church, but did he call
National
him
Catholic Church.
But did he call himself an Old Catholic, or did he call himself a Mexican National Catholic?
He recognized that he was old Catholic.
Okay.
But he never formally referred to him. He was just,
Right.
you know.
Padre Emilio.
And it had a huge congregation. But by the time I got there in 1983, the church had declined. It was a small, dying community. He was an Olympiad. He ran in the 1936 Olympics for Mexico. You know. So anyway, he ordained someone that I knew at that time, Patrick Joseph Callahan, who ordained Augustin Sicard, who started the Ecumenical Catholic Diocese of the Americas, and he's in San Antonio, Texas. He ordained in 1995 C. Daniel Gensig, who became the American Old Catholic, the head of the American Old Catholic Church of Colorado. And I invited him to join the ECC, and he refused. He's very anti-gay. That's why he refuses. It's too bad. But he was the one who ordained me. I'm the one who ordained Francis. So you can kind of see the apostolic succession all the way back to Varley.
Wow, that's
And that
cool.
goes all the way back to, and we have a book. This goes all the way back to Peter. So my apostolic succession comes from Peter, the apostle, all the way down to these guys to here. Is that interesting to you?
You sent that list, you gave that list out during our,
Yeah.
our steady.
I think I did. I wanted to add the
I can
picture
see
so you
this.
can kind of see.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'll send it to you as an attachment so you can have it with your documents in your computer. Now, did you hear all that? Barb?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to be, the document I just described with photos of these various bishops, I'm going to be sending to you as an attachment, along with the text that we read tonight. And
Okay, great.
then I'm going to figure out how to get this other handout I'm giving you. This is a copy of the article that the National Catholic Reporter, it's a Roman Catholic paper, they in 1999 came out and interviewed me. This is when I was a young bishop. And I had no idea what they were going to write about it, but this is really good because he did his homework. So after what I've told you tonight, when you read this article, and it's talking about St. Matthew Church, you'll see the connection. So I'm giving you this for you to take home. I'll be sending this to you electronically, and
We can mail a hard copy of that to Barb.
oh, Barb, we're going to send you a hard copy of this article I'm passing out.
We can scan it too.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I was thinking you can scan it and send it.
Well, we'll scan it and send it, whatever. This is an important article in our history because it contributes to the formation of the ECC.
Can I have one more of those? I want to give it to someone.
Oh, okay. Here you go.
Thank you.
So, this concludes the narrative for tonight. This is as far as we can go. The next time I meet with you, we will pick up from this, and I can talk to you about what I have been a witness to in terms of how St. Matthew's was formed, how I was elected to become a bishop, and then how the ECC was formed and our subsequent history. But in the meantime, you can read that article. That'll prepare you for the next lecture, which we'll do in 2 weeks, right?
In 2 weeks? Yeah,
The date
okay.
on that,
Yeah.
let's see.
2 weeks, okay, Barb?
That's great.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Now, at some point, will we also be talking about, well, we will be talking about differentiators, the 7 differentiators or whatever, but also in terms of how the Catholic Church would think of us, or what their
Yeah.
argument would be against what we're doing and
Right.
so forth.
That's what we'll do at the next lesson. It'll be,
The distinctive.
The distinctives. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll be able to get into that in greater detail. And that lecture will be just on recent events and about how the ECC formed.
Yeah.
And fill you in on all that. Does that sound good, Barb?
Great.
Sounds wonderful.
Okay, great. Well, I think now is the time for us to pray. Anybody have any other questions besides Michael's question? Is this helpful?
Very, very helpful.
Okay.